The chamber smelled like old air and older decisions. It always did. Galactic Council had been meeting in this station for 300 years, and in 300 years nobody had thought to fix the ventilation, or nobody had cared to. There was a difference, and the Polari Delegate Sue had long since stopped trying to figure out which one it was. He sat in his chair, third row outer arc, the seat his people had occupied since the original compact, and watched the chamber fill. 23 species, 41 delegates, enough translation hardware hanging from the ceiling to run a small city. The room was big enough to land a mid-sized shuttle in, and it felt, as it always did, like a room that had decided its own importance a long time ago, and had been living off that decision ever since. The Keth delegation arrived last. They always arrived last. It was not accidental. Vorath walked in ahead of his subordinates, which was also not accidental. He was tall even for a grayscaled, wide across the shoulders, with the particular kind of stillness that came from never having had a reason to flinch. 300 years of military dominance produced that stillness. Sue had seen it before in old records in older species. It always looked the same. It always ended the same. He watched Vorath take his seat at the head of the primary table and felt something quiet and tired move through him. The session opened. A breath delegate immediately began complaining about asteroid mining rights in the outer Kazan belt. This took 40 minutes. Then, a Divari representative raised a point of procedural order that turned out to be about the same thing, which took another 20. Sue listened to all of it and thought about his morning meal, which had been good, and about the message he had received 3 days ago from the Polari Historical Archive, which had not been. The archive had flagged something pattern in the long-range observation data. Quiet where there should not be quiet, or rather a very specific kind of quiet, not the quiet of absence, the quiet of something holding still. He had filed a formal notice of concern. The Council's administrative office had received it, cataloged it under Tier 4 monitoring items, and moved on. This was, Sue reflected, entirely predictable. The mining dispute resolved, a new item came to the floor. Vorath stood. He did not need to signal for attention. Room gave it to him the way rooms gave things to people who had never been told no. The matter of the Sol exclusion zone, he said. His translator rendered it flat and precise. Keith had no tonal inflection. Everything they said arrived like a verdict. It has been 11 years since any registered human vessel transited exclusion zone borders. 11 years since any human diplomatic communication was received by this body. 11 years since any human presence was recorded at any council-affiliated station, port, or waypoint. He paused. The reasonable conclusion is that the human state has experienced terminal systemic collapse. Sue looked at his hands. The Sol exclusion zone, Vorshath continued, represents 42 inhabited system, 317 cataloged resource deposits, and 11 navigational corridors of strategic value. It has sat fallow for over a decade. The Keth supremacy formally proposes that this body vote to dissolve the exclusion zone designation and open the territory to standard colonial claim procedures. The Dravari delegate more leaned forward. What timeline are we discussing for? Immediately, Vorshath said there is no administrative reason for delay. stood up. He did it slowly because he was old and his joints had opinions about standing, but he stood in the room. Noticed the Polari were not a large species and they were not a powerful one, but Su had been sitting in this chamber for 60 years. He had a kind of weight that had nothing to do with size. I object, he said. Vorsheth looked at him not unkindly, the way something large and certain looks at something small and inconvenient. Delegate Su, on what grounds? On the grounds, Su said, that 11 years of silence from a species that has survived every attempt to remove them from the galaxy is not a death certificate, it is a warning. The chamber made a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite dismissal, something between the two, designed to be polite about its rudeness. The humans, said the Tharvan delegate, a young one, new to our seat, had a peak fleet capacity of roughly 900 vessels at their last recorded census. They had no unified military doctrine. Their technology, while creative, was not assessed as I know what it was assessed as. Su said, I also know what it was assessed as 300 years ago, before the First Contact War, and 200 years ago, before the boundary conflicts. Each time the assessment was wrong. Each time the galaxy learned this in a way it found difficult to recover from. With respect, said Vorsheth, and there was that tone, the tone of someone using the phrase to discard what came before it. Those conflicts were prosecuted by a different military command under different conditions against a human civilization that no longer exists in that form. The humans who went quiet 11 years ago were a fragmented post-crisis species with significant internal political failures and declining industrial output. The evidence strongly supports the evidence. Su said, restores whatever story we decide to tell about its silence. He sat back down, his joints complained. The vote was called 21 for dissolution of the Soul Exclusion Zone, 2 against S's Polari vote, and the Orth delegate, small species with long memories, who voted with Su on almost everything and never said why. The resolution passed. The administrative secretary began the formal language of the annexation document. Voreth sat down with the satisfaction of a thing that had gone exactly as expected. Moore was already pulling up navigational charts. The Tharvan delegate was marking resource priorities on a shared data table. Chamber had moved on with the efficient energy of a body that had just done something it considered routine. Su looked at the ceiling. The ventilation hummed. He thought about the archive message, the quiet that was not absence, the particular stillness of something holding still. He thought about the First Contact War. He had read the records so many times they lived in him. Now, like furniture, the initial human losses, the signing, the withdrawal, the 40 years of nothing, and then the return. He thought about the officer who had commanded the human fleet on the day they came back. The records quoted her pre-engagement address to her crew. It had been 6 words: we built now, let's go home. 6 words. He was still thinking about them when the long-grain sensor array screamed. Not an alert, not a warning tone, a scream. The sound the system made when it encountered something that broke the parameters of what it was designed to expect. Su had been in this chamber for 60 years, and he had never heard it make that sound. The chamber stopped. Every delegate, every aide, every translator, and administrative staffer stopped. The annexation document hung half-finished on the main display. Moore's navigational charts froze mid-load. The tactical officer on duty, a Keth of course. The Keth ran Council Station security. Looked at his board, then he looked at it again, then he said something in his own language that the translation system rendered a little uncertainly as contact. Vorhath was on his feet before the word finished. Classification unknown. The officer's voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when the brain is moving too fast for tone. Single contact, deep space, bearing 774. Relative distance. Vorhath said, closing fast, sir, very fast. It was not there 20 seconds ago. The main display shifted. The annexation document disappeared, replaced by the long-range tactical feed, and there it was, a single white point moving on the display at a speed that made the scale bar on the chart look like a suggestion. No transponder signal, no running lights, no identification band, just mass reading that the sensor system was in real time, visibly struggling to calculate correctly because it kept returning numbers that could not be right. Hail it, Vorhath said. The communications officer sent the standard hail Council frequencies, all bands. Please identify, please identify. Identify. The white point moved. It did not answer. It did not slow down. Sue watched the display. He watched the point move, crossing distance that should have taken hours as crossing it in the time it took the administrative secretary to stop breathing and the Tharvan delegate to push back from the table and Moore to grab the edge of his console with both hands. It was heading here. It had been heading here since before the sensors found it. It had always been heading here. Vorhath was issuing orders. The KTH fleet was moving. The 400 warships in Council orbit beginning to shift into formation. The kill-it pattern that had ended every military confrontation the KTH had chosen to have for the last century. 400 ships, the most lethal formation in the known galaxy. Not a question and answer to a question nobody had asked yet. The white point kept moving on the display. The mass reading finally resolved. The sensor system gave up trying to classify the contact and simply reported the number. The number was wrong. It had to be wrong. Nothing was that big. Sue looked at the number. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the display at the single white point crossing the chart at impossible speed. And he thought about the 6 words, "We built, now let's go home," and then on the tactical display in the space between 1 second and the next, the white point stopped being a point. It expanded. The sensor return bloomed outward into shape and dimension and hard angles and scale. And the scale was wrong. The scale was all wrong, and the chamber was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that had nothing polite in it. And Vorhath stood at the head of the tactical display and looked at what had just appeared in Council space. The ship had decloaked. Sue closed his eyes. He had known in the way of someone who has been watching the sky long enough to recognize what kind of cloud brings what kind of weather. That this day would come. He had filed his notices. He had cast his votes. He had stood up in this chamber and said the word warning into rooms that were already deciding not to hear it. Now the room was hearing it, too late, but hearing it. He opened his eyes. The ship was on the display. Every sensor array on the station was locked onto it now, feeding data, and the data was coming Back wrong in every direction, wrong. Size wrong, power signature wrong. Materials composition according to anything in the database, wrong in the way that things are wrong when they were built by someone who had stopped caring. What the database said, Voreth was standing very still, the killet. Formation was complete, 400 warships. Every gun in Council space pointed at one target. The ship did not stop, it did not evade, it did not hail, it flew at standard crew speed through the kill net through the middle of 400 warships that were watching it with every targeting system they had, and it flew the way something flies when it already knows the ending. The communications board lit up, incoming signal on a human frequency, the first human communication in 11 years. The communications officer looked at Vorsheth. Vorsheth nodded. The signal opened one voice, a woman tired, in the way of someone who had been building something for a long time and had just put the last piece in place. You voted on our space, she said. That was your mistake. The signal closed. Sue sat in his chair in the third row of the outer arc, in the seat his people had occupied for 300 years, in the chamber that smelled like old air and older decisions, and he thought, yes, there it is. The ventilation hummed. Nobody else moved. Her name was Yarov's, and she had not slept in 31 hours. This was not unusual. In the last 11 years it had become, if not usual, then at least familiar, the long arithmetic of preparation stretching into days and weeks until the days and weeks stopped having edges and became simply the work. The work was its own kind of time. She stood at the forward observation post of the Pale Resolve and looked at 400 warships arranging themselves around her. The display tracked them in green, each one tagged, each one resolved into specifications: engine class, weapon load, shield rating, crew capacity. Because Pale Resolve's passive sensor suite had been pulling data from Council military band since before she decloaked, and what it pulled it filed, and what it filed it knew. She had known the killet was coming before the first K-ship moved. She had known its dimensions before it was finished. She had known, looking at it complete, that it was designed to be an answer that did not require a question. 400 warships. She looked at them. She thought, we counted on 600 minimum. The contingency planning had assumed 600. The actual number was 400. She filed the discrepancy as a data point, the way she filed most things, without comment, without judgment, just the number and what it meant. What it meant was that the KTH had not in 11 years increased their active fleet presence at Council Station. What it meant was that the estimates had been right. They had not been watching. Behind her, the bridge of the Pale Resolve ran at operational tempo, quiet but not still. The particular rhythm of a crew that had been doing this together long enough that they didn't need to narrate it. Lieutenant Commander Fenn was at navigation. Chief Ockeper was running sensor analysis. 3 other officers she had chosen personally for the same reason. She had chosen all of them. They were good at their jobs, and they had stopped asking permission for things that didn't require it. She had built the crew the same way she had built everything else in the last 11 years. Carefully, without announcement. There. Locked on, Fenn said, not alarmed. Informational. I know all 400. I know. Fenn, he nodded and went back to his board. The Pale Resolve moved at standard cruise speed. This was also deliberate, not a Provocation, a statement, the difference between the two was important. And provocation invited a response. Statement simply was, she was making a statement with the speed, with the heading, with the silence she had kept on all frequencies since they entered council space. Every choice was a word in a sentence she had been composing for a long time. She thought about the sentence now, whether it was complete, whether it said what it needed to say. The forward display updated. The kill net was fully formed, 400 ships each, one a node in a targeting web that had, by every conventional military calculation, a kill probability of 100% against any known target. Every known target, activate the array, she said. Akapper's hands moved. Deflection array active. What happened next took about 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds the Pale Resolve did something that had no entry in any council military database, because nothing in the council's military history had ever needed to do it. The deflection array, which was not a shield, which had no analog in any technology that the council's engineering teams had been tracking, reached out across the targeting web and took every weapons lock from every one of 400 ships and redirected those locks back at the ships that generated them. It was not destructive. Nothing fired. Nothing was damaged. What it was precise. Every targeting system on every one of those 400 warships now showed a lock on itself. Every gun in the kill net was pointed in the operational logic of the targeting systems at the ship that owned it. Nobody fired. Nobody could. The kill it sat there complete and intact and entirely useless in the Pale Resolve moved through the middle of it at standard cruise speed, and Yara watched the display and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, something quieter than both, the feeling of a thing going the way it was built to go. She had not named the feeling in 11 years. She saw no reason to start now. 3 months after the silence began, a council observation drone had passed through the outer edge of the Sol exclusion zone. Survey pass automated, looking for resource signals and hazard markers, the kind of thing that happened routinely, filed routinely, read by someone in an office somewhere who added the notation zone clear, no activity, and moved on. Yara had been at that point 60 m underground in a facility that did not appear on any map the council had access to, watching the whole plating go onto the third frame of the Pale Resolve's secondary drive assembly. She had watched the drones approach on the perimeter sensors, watched it complete its pass, watched it log its notation, watched it leave. It had seen nothing. By that point the facility had been operating for 2 years. Pale Resolve was 18% complete. She thought about that drone sometimes, not with contempt. The council had done exactly what it could reasonably be expected to do. You sent drones, you log notations, you assess based on what you could see. This was rational. The error was not in the assessment. The error was in assuming that what you could see was what existed. Humans had been making things that were hard to see for a long time. It was not a technological gift. It was a learned behavior the galaxy had taught them. The first time the KTH had come into human space 300 years ago, before the wars had names, they had done it with 200 ships and a set of terms that were not terms so much as a list of what they intended to take. The humans of that time had been young. They had not known The rules they had tried to negotiate, and the Keth had explained patiently. That negotiation was something that happened between parties of comparable capability, and that the humans were welcome to have whatever feelings they liked about the terms as long as they accepted them. The humans of that time had accepted them, then they had gone home. 40 years later, they came back. The ships they came back with did not look like the ships that had lost. That was the thing the histories never quite conveyed. It was not incremental improvement. It was as if the humans had taken the experience of losing and done something to it, run it through some interior process, and produced on the other side of that process something that the people who had made them lose were not prepared for. The Keth in the histories described this as unexpected, as if it was a surprise, as if the 40 years of silence had been anything other than what it was. Sull of the Polari had written in his own historical analysis that the Keth and the species like them suffered from a failure of imagination, not technical imagination. They could imagine new weapons, new formations, new tactics. What they could not imagine was interiority, what happened inside the people they defeated, what defeat felt like from the inside, and what it built. Yara had read that analysis 14 times. She kept it on her personal terminal, not because she needed reminding, because it was the most accurate single description of what the last 11 years had been that she had ever encountered in any document produced by any species. She turned from the observation post and walked to the command chair. She did not sit in it. She never sat in it during operational phases. She stood behind it, hands on the back, and looked at the tactical display. The council station was ahead. She could see it on visual. Now, a structure that had taken 300 years to build, layered with additions and modifications from a dozen species, enormous and complicated, and lit up with the running lights of the fleet. It was trying to hide it behind. She thought about the woman in the photo in her cabin, then she stopped thinking about it. That was a thing for later. Later was a place she had been building toward for 11 years, and she was almost there, and she would not spend the remaining distance with her attention anywhere but here. Open a channel to the council, she said. Channel open, said Akafor. She looked at the station. She thought about everything she had built, and everyone who had helped her build it, and the 48 months of simulations, and the arguments she had won, and the arguments she had lost in the morning 2 years ago, when the pale resolve had cleared atmosphere for the first time under its own power, and she had been on the bridge alone because she had sent the crew out on a scheduled maintenance rotation so that she could be alone for it. Just for that first morning, she looked at the station and thought, we wanted to be left alone. Then she said, you voted on our space. That was your mistake. She cut the channel behind her. The bridge was quiet. Fen turned in his chair. He was young. Fen, 32. He had been 21 when the work started. He had grown up inside this project the way you grow up inside anything that takes longer than you expected and changes you in the process. He said, what now? Now we wait. Yara said, they'll call back. She was right. The council channel opened 4 minutes later. A different voice this time, a translator's neutral tone carrying Vorath's words at one remove. Unidentified human vessel, you are in violation of 17 council regulations regarding unauthorized military transit through. I know, Yara said, you can list Them for the record if you want. It'll give your administrative staff something to do while your admiral thinks. She cut the channel again. The bridge was very quiet. Then Chief Akefer made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a small sound contained. Professional sorry, he said. Don't be, Yara said. She walked back to the observation post and looked at the kill net intact and useless, and at the 400 ships sitting in it with their guns pointed at themselves, and at the station beyond them. And she thought about what she had spent 11 years building and what it had cost and what it was going to do, and she felt the tiredness in her the way she always felt it, not as a complaint but as a record. She had been keeping that record for a long time. It was almost full. Sir Akefer, message from Earth. Second phase is authorized. She nodded. Prepare the package. Ready on your signal. She looked at the station. She thought about the vote they had taken that morning, 21-2. Her space, her people's space, voted on like a line item in a budget. She said the data package left the pale resolve at the speed of a standard broadcast signal, and it went everywhere. Every ship in the killet, every sensor array on the station, every monitoring band the council operated in this sector. It was not encrypted, it was not coded, it was a public document, formatted for maximum clarity, designed to be read by every tactical officer. Council space simultaneously. It was a list, ship names, specifications, armament, location, 216 entries. Yara watched the display. She watched the killet, which had not moved in 12 minutes. She watched the station where the lights were not dimming but somehow looked like they should be. She thought about Sue of the Polari, who had voted against the annexation. She thought about the filing she had intercepted 3 years ago, a Tier 4 monitoring notice, language careful and academic, saying in the polite vocabulary of someone who had been ignored before. This silence is not an absence. She thought about whoever had written that filing, sitting in that chamber for 60 years watching. She hoped he was there. Today, she thought he was somewhere on the station. A Keth officer was reading the list, reading the numbers, running the calculations that you run when you receive a document like that, the arithmetic of force multiplication and fleet coverage and engagement windows, running them and getting the same answer every time, no matter how many times you ran them. She had run those calculations herself. They only produced one answer. She stood at the observation post of the pale resolve and looked at the 400 ships that could not fire and felt the tiredness in her, the full and complete record of 11 years, and thought, almost done. The chamber broke along its fault lines. Every governing body has them, the old divisions, the historical grudges, the alliances of convenience that hold until holding is no longer convenient. 300 years of Keth dominance had papered over most of the council's fault lines, but paper is what it was, and the data package had burned through it, and the time it took to read the first 10 entries on the list. More of the Dravari was on his feet. His voice, translated, came out flat and urgent. The KE assured this body that the exclusion zone was being monitored. I would like to know what that monitoring consisted of. The monitoring was consistent with council protocol, said Vorshath's aide. Vorshath himself was not looking at anyone in the room. He was looking at the tactical display, where the list was still up, where the numbers were still the same numbers they had been 10 minutes ago. Council protocol, Mo said, clearly did not include looking. The Dravari said the Tharvan delegate seconded the original monitoring resolution. You might recall the vote. I recall every vote I've made in this chamber. That's how I know which ones to regret. Enough, said Vorath. Room stopped. He stood finally. He turned from the display and looked at the chamber with the expression of someone who had woken up in a situation. They had been carefully constructing the impossibility of the data package. He said, maybe fabricated. May, sir. His aide put a hand on his arm briefly, then removed it. Our sensor arrays have confirmed 17 of the listed contacts, the ones closest to exclusion zone borders. The readings match the listed specifications. The room absorbed this. Sul of the Polari sat in the third row of the outer arc and watched the chamber, and thought, there it is, the moment when the story the room has been telling about itself meets the story that is actually happening. He had seen it before in smaller ways, over 60 years. The way a face moves when a conviction starts to come apart. The way a body shifts when it realizes the ground underfoot is not what it thought. He watched Vorhath's body still controlled, but something happening beneath the control, that the control was working harder than usual to manage. The Tharvan delegate was speaking again, something about verification procedures, independent assessment, requesting a delay in any response pending confirmation of the data's authenticity. Her voice had the particular rhythm of someone filling silence because silence had become dangerous. The young ones always filled the silence. Sue sat and let the silence be filled in thought about the first time he had encountered the human archive material. He had been 12 years into his service as Polari historical consultant, and someone had flagged an anomaly in the pre-console records, a species that appeared 3 times in different archive collections, under different names and with a 50-year gap between the second and third appearances. He had gone looking. What he found had taken him 6 months to fully read, not because it was long, because it was difficult, not technically. The translation matrices handled it well enough. It was difficult the way some things were difficult, the way you could understand each word and still need to sit with the sentence for a while before it became real. The humans documented everything, every war, every defeat, every treaty signed under conditions that the documents themselves described, with remarkable consistency across centuries and cultures as unfair. They documented what they felt about those defeats with a specificity that Sue had not encountered in any other species archive. Other species recorded what happened. Humans recorded what it was like. He had read accounts from the First Contact War, not the Keth accounts, the human ones, ground level personal records, the voices of people who had lived through the years after the signing, the aftermath of being told that the terms were what they were, and that was that. There was grief in those records, there was anger, there was something underneath both of those things that Sue had spent years trying to name correctly. Determination was too clean a word, stubbornness was too simple, the closest he had found working across translation matrices and idiom gaps was something like the decision that this will not be the ending, not a plan, not yet, just the refusal to accept that the story was over, sitting with the refusal for 40 years, letting it become of everything built on top of it. He thought about that foundation now. The chamber was still arguing. Vorsheth's aide was pulling up sensor confirmation data. The Dravari and the Tharvan were no longer technically allies and were demonstrating this loudly. The administrative secretary had stopped trying to document the conversation and was staring at the main display. The main display still showed the list, 216 ships. Su stood up. He did it slowly as always. His joints as always had opinions. The room as always gave him the particular quality of attention that 60 years in a chair produces, not deference exactly, more like the instinct to wait and see. I would like, he said, to say something about the historical record. Vorsheth looked at him flat. Heavy delegate Su. It will take 3 minutes, Su said, possibly 4. I am old and I talk slowly, please. A beat, then Vorsheth sat down. Something in the gesture, the sitting, the giving of the 3 minutes told Saul more than anything the admiral had said. In the last hour, a being who believed the ground was still solid didn't sit down. Like that, Su looked at the chamber, all of it, the 23 species, the 41 delegates, the ceiling with its translation hardware, the display with its list. 300 years ago, he said, a KE fleet entered human space with a list of terms. The humans accepted those terms, then they withdrew. For 40 years we, the council, the watching species, the various powers, who considered themselves interested parties, interpreted that withdrawal as defeat, as proof that the conflict had concluded, that the matter was settled. He paused. When they returned after those 40 years, the species that had given them the terms found itself facing something it had no preparation for, because it had spent 40 years assuming the matter was settled. The room was quiet, not the argumentative quiet of before, a different quality. 60 years ago, a similar pattern began. The humans had been not defeated this time, but pressured, pushed. A series of border disputes, trade sanctions, 2 military incidents that were not formally declared as conflicts, but that everyone in this chamber knows were not accidents. Over the course of roughly decade, human space was systematically constrained, their trade access reduced, their diplomatic standing on this body diminished, and then 11 years ago they went quiet. He looked at Voreth. And we voted on their space this morning. The silence in the room had weight now. I am not, Su said carefully, suggesting that the numbers on that display are anything other than what they claim to be. I am not suggesting that the ship sitting in our space is bluffing, or that the deflection technology is a prototype being tested rather than an operational system. I am suggesting that those possibilities are available to us as comfortable interpretations of an uncomfortable reality, and that this body has historically chosen comfortable interpretations, and that this has historically been a mistake. He sat down. His joints for once did not complain, or he didn't notice. The Orth delegate, small, quiet, the one who always voted with him, made a sound that might have been the Orth equivalent of yes. Hard to say. The Orth were difficult to read. Vorsheth was looking at the display. Again, he had the expression of a person running calculations and not enjoying the results. The data package, he said, slowly lists coordinates for each vessel. It does, said his aide. Pull the nearest 3 on screen. The display shifted. 3 of the listed human ships resolved from text entries into sensor readings pulled from the Council's own monitoring arrays at the coordinates listed in the package. The readings matched the specifications in the package to within sensor margin 3 of 216. The chamber did not make a sound. More of the Drevri sat down very carefully, the way you sit down when your legs have decided they have opinions. Vorhath stood looking at the 3 readings for a long time. Then he said, "Pull the rest, sir." It would take approximately pull them. It took 12 minutes. The display updated in real time as each contact resolved, each one a white point on the tactical chart, each one tagged with the name and specifications from the list, each one sitting exactly where the list said it was sitting, not concentrated in one place, distributed, spread through human space and around its borders, and in several cases in positions that the Council's own charts classified as not enemy territory exactly, but not friendly strategic positions that a species placing a fleet for maximum effect would choose. 216 contacts, every one of them real. The display when it was done looked like someone had spilled something across the map of the galaxy, and the something had known exactly where it wanted to land. Sue looked at it. He thought about the archive material, the ground level voices from 300 years ago, the refusal to accept that the story was over. He thought about 40 years of building, then 11, the patience in that, not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of working every day toward something specific and far away. He had not encountered that quality in many species. The ones that had it had usually acquired it the same way. The channel from the pale resolve opened, the same voice Yarrow still, with that quality of tiredness that was not defeat. "I see you're looking at the list," she said. Nobody answered. Immediately, the chamber was full of 23 species who had each independently arrived at the same calculation, and the calculation had one answer, and nobody wanted to be the first to say the answer out loud, because saying it out loud made it real. "I can give you time," Yara said. "I can give you an hour. After the hour, I will be docking at Council Station 2. Deliver terms. I would prefer the chamber to be in session when I arrive." A pause. "If it would help, I will tell you now that the terms are not designed to be punitive. They are designed to prevent this conversation from needing to happen again." Another pause. "An hour." The channel closed. Vorhath sat with both hands flat on the table in front of him. He was looking at the display. He said very quietly to no one in particular how his aide said nothing. 11 years we had. There were monitoring sweeps. There were observation passes. How do you build? He stopped, looked at the display, the 216 contacts, the positions, the specifications. How do you build this without us knowing? Saul almost said, "The same way you built your fleet without asking our permission." He didn't. There was a time for that, and this wasn't it. There would be enough time for that kind of accounting later, in the long years of adjustment that were going to follow. Today had its own work. He said instead, "They are very good at building things they don't want found." Vorhath looked at him. Sue met the look. "It is the central thing about them. It always has been. Every species in this chamber has a central thing. The Keth have military projection. The Dravari have resource extraction. The Polari have." He paused. "Old habit. We the humans have this. They make things, they hide them, and then when they choose to, they show them." The chamber was quiet. On the display, 216 White Point sat where they sat and did not move and did not need to. Vorhath looked at them for a long time, then he said, "We have 59 minutes." The docking bay of Council Station was built to accommodate many things. It was not built for the Pale Resolve. The ship had to park at the external hard dock, the framework used for vessels too large for the bays, the kind of framework that saw use maybe 3 times a decade when a key carrier needed resupply. The Pale Resolve docked at it the way a grown thing fits into the space that was sized for a smaller version of itself. It fit, but only just, and the station's infrastructure made a number of concerning sounds in the process that the engineering staff chose to classify as within tolerance rather than examine too closely. Yara walked through the docking corridor alone. This was also a choice. She had offered Fenn the walk as a joke, and he had looked at her with the expression of someone who knows when they're being tested and doesn't want to fail the test, and she had told him she was kidding, and he had visibly not been sure, and she had left him on the bridge with Akafor and the sensor feeds and the channel open. The corridor was long. Station corridors always were built by committee, extended over centuries, full of the architectural evidence of every decision that had ever been reconsidered. Sewell lighting fixtures next to KE conduit casing next to something in the walls that nobody could identify because the species that installed it had not been heard from in 80 years. The Galaxian cross-section running about 40 m between her and the chamber doors. She walked it at the same pace she walked everything, not slow, not fast. The corridor smelled like recycled air and what she'd come to think of as official. Every station, every government building, every place where decisions got made and then pretended they had been inevitable, they all smelled like this, like something was being processed. She thought about the first time she had walked into a council building. She had been 26. Junior 8s. The meeting had been about trade corridor access, the kind of meeting that produced 18-page documents full of phrases like mutually agreeable framework and pending further review, and resulted after 6 months of further review in exactly the access reduction that the KTH had wanted from the beginning. She had sat in the back of the room and watched the process and understood in the specific way you understand things when you are 26, and paying close attention that the process was not a process, it was a performance. The decision had already been made. The performance was for them, for her, for the human delegation, so they would feel they had been heard. She had gone home after that meeting and applied to the engineering directorate 21 years ago. She reached the chamber doors. 2 Keth guards flanked them, standard security, the kind that was present at every council session as a matter of procedure. They were very large and very still and armed with weapons that their targeting systems currently would not allow them to use on a specific set of targets. They opened the doors. The chamber looked the same as she remembered it, bigger in person than they schematics. The translation hardware on the ceiling caught the lice and scattered it. The table was an oval, enormous, built to accommodate bodies ranging from the 1M orth to the 2 and 12M, 23 species, 41 delegates, every eye in the room on her. She walked to the human seat. It had been empty since the silence began. Someone had cleaned it, kept it. She noticed that whoever maintained this chamber had not removed the chair, had not filled the Space with something else, she filed it. Without comment, it was a data point. She sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Vorheth sat across into the left the Keth position at the primary table. He was watching her with the flat attention of someone who had spent the last hour revising every calculation he had and was still not happy with the results. She looked at the room. Olive. The terms, she said, are four things. She laid them out simply. The way you lay out anything you have spent years thinking about, without preamble, without softening, without the diplomatic language that performed accessibility while practicing obscurity. First, the Sol exclusion zone restored to its original boundaries, permanently designated with a buffer corridor of 2 light years on all sides, no council vessel, military or otherwise, in that corridor without prior notification and consent. No exceptions, no review period. Second, 3K colonial stations in human adjacent space. She named them. She had their coordinates memorized, transferred to human administrative control with their current populations, their infrastructure, their operational status intact. The populations could stay or go as they chose. The stations were not negotiable. Third, the human seat at this table, permanent with full voting rights and equal standing under the council charter, not an observer seat, not a provisional membership, full standing. Fourth, the vote from this morning, the Sol exclusion zone annexation 21-2, formally nullified in writing with every signator's mark. She stopped. The room was quiet. Vorsheth said, the stations are key sovereign territory. There is no provision under council law for compelled. I'm aware. Yara said, I'm not asking under council law. Then under what? Under the same authority you used this morning when you voted on my space. The room was quiet. Again, a different kind of quiet. More of the Dari looked at the table. The Tharvan delegate looked at her hands. The Orth delegate, small and still in their chair, was looking at Yara with an expression she couldn't read and decided not to try. Vorsheth leaned forward. His voice stayed even controlled, but the control was doing more work than it had been an hour ago. You are threatening military action against council member territories. You understand that this body. I'm not threatening anything, Yara said. I'm stating terms. The distinction is important. She looked at him. Threat is conditional. It depends on what you do next. These terms are not conditional. They are what's happening. The question in front of you is the details of the process. Silence. Vorsheth's jaw did something that his species physiology did when a significant number of responses were presenting themselves simultaneously, and none of them were good options. She had read about the expression in the xenobiology files. She recognized it. Now, he said, you would move against this body, against 23 species with 216 ships, against a combined council fleet of I know the numbers. Yara said, I've been counting council ships for 11 years. She meant it as a statement. It landed the way it was always going to land, as a demonstration. 11 years. She had been watching them for 11 years, running the same arithmetic. They were only now running about her, and the arithmetic had told her the same thing it was telling them now, which was that this conversation was already over and had been before it started. Voreth looked at her for a long time. Then he said, the colony populations on those stations, I said they stay or go as they choose. I meant it. This isn't about the populations. She paused. This is about the stations, the positions, the message. The position send. She looked at the room again, all of it, all 23 species. I want there to be a buffer, not a military buffer, a clarity buffer, a clear line in space that says, this is where human territory is, this is where it stops, this side of the line, you're welcome, other side of the line. She stopped. We prefer you didn't, Moore said from his seat quietly. Why didn't you do this before? Years ago, you had the capability. At some point in those 11 years, you had the capability. Why didn't you? He stopped, realized perhaps how the question sounded, but Yara did not look offended. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for that question. Not eagerly, the way you wait for something that needs to happen because we didn't want to, she said. The room was very still. We wanted to be left alone. She said it simply, no performance in it, no anger, just the sentence sitting. They're doing its work, we are not. We were never interested in the galaxy in the way that the galaxy seems to be interested in itself. We don't want the stations in principle. We don't want the fleet. We built the fleet because you kept making it necessary. She looked at Vorhath. You voted on our space this morning. That vote is the reason I'm here, not the vote today, the pattern of votes, the decisions made in this room. Over 60 years, the access reductions and the trade sanctions and the border incidents that were not accidents and the monitoring sweeps that were designed to find nothing and did. Every one of those was a choice. Every one of those said, you don't matter enough to be left alone. She looked at the table. We disagreed. Sol of the Polari in the third row of the outer arc made a sound very small, barely audible, the kind of sound a person makes when they have been carrying something for a long time and something shifts. Vorhath was very still. He was not a stupid being. That was the thing about the Keth. They were never stupid. They were wrong in specific ways. They mistook the absence of visible capability for the absence of capability. They mistook patience for passivity. They mistook the willingness to absorb damage for the inability to inflict it, but they were not stupid. And Vorhath, sitting in his chair with the weight of 216 contacts on every sensor array he controlled, was doing the same thing Yara had done 11 years ago when she had walked out of a meeting room and applied to the engineering directorate. He was understanding something new about how things worked. She watched him understand it. She did not hurry him. She had time. She had more time now than she had had in 11 years. She thought about Fen on the bridge monitoring the feeds. She thought about Akefer and the crew, all of them, all the people who had been underground with her in those early years, who had worked the shifts and run the simulations and watched the hull plating go on piece by piece. She thought about the photo in her cabin later. That was a thing for later, the second term. Vorhath said he was not conceding. He was navigating. There was a difference. And she knew it, and she was going to let him have the distinction because she was not here to take his pride. She was here to take the stations and the vote and the permanent seat, and those three things she would not move on. Stations are not negotiable, she said. But I'm open to a timeline for transfer of administrative control, 90 days. Vorhath looked at his aide. His aide, after a moment, nodded once. Vorhath looked at the table at the display behind her, which still showed the list, still showed the numbers, still showed what 11 years looked like when you did the work. Then he looked at her, the fourth term. He said the vote this morning, you want it nullified in writing, she said, signed by every delegate who voted for it. His jaw did the thing again, but he said, that can be arranged. Sue spoke clear and quiet. From the third row, sign it, he said. The room looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at anyone in particular, old and tired and present in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a specific thing and has now seen it. Sign it, he said again, all of it. The room was quiet. The mirror of the Dravari picked up the stylus in one by one, starting from the seat farthest from Vorhath and moving around the table in the slow, significant rhythm of a thing becoming official. They did pale resolve. Undocked at 1400 station time. No ceremony, no escort, no final statement. On any open channel, the ship released from the hard dock framework, cleared the station's proximity zone and moved to cruise, heading back toward the Sol exclusion zone, back toward the buffer corridor that was, as of 4 hours ago, formally and permanently, and in writing, human space. On the bridge, Fenn handled the departure with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing their job for a long time and was ready to go home. Aquifer ran the post-operation system checks. The rest of the crew moved through their stations in the low energy rhythm of a ship that had done the thing it came to do and was heading back. Yara was in her cabin. She sat on the edge of the bunk, not lying down, just sitting the way you sit when you have been standing for a long time, and sitting feels strange and good and strange again. The cabin was small. She had chosen a small cabin on purpose. Large cabin would have been wrong for reasons she had never needed to articulate. On the desk propped against the edge of the terminal was the photo. She looked at it, a woman, early 50s, standing in front of something that was not yet recognizable as the pale Resolve's forward hull, because in the photo it was still just the first frame. Raw material, the skeleton of a thing that did not exist yet. The woman was laughing at something off camera. The laugh was enormous, the kind of laugh that takes over a face and doesn't apologize for it. Her mother had died 4 years into the project, not from anything dramatic, from the kind of thing that happens when people get older and the body decides it is done. She had known it was coming. Her mother had known it was coming. They had had the conversations. They had said the things her mother had also said 3 weeks before, in the particular voice she used when she was being both completely serious and completely gentle at the same time. Finish it, whatever happens, finish it. She looked at the photo for another minute, then she set it face down on the desk, not to hide it, just to put it down, and stood up and went to the small window, space outside stars, the bulk of Council Station receding behind them, far ahead, too far to see the invisible line of the buffer corridor, and then her space beyond it. Clean, formally, permanently. Writing clean. She put her hand flat against the window. Cold, always cold. The glass, not glass, a composite, but it felt like glass, was always cold against her hand, and she had been pressing her hand against windows her whole life because the cold helped her think, or maybe it didn't help her think, but it gave her hand something to do while she thought, and the distinction had stopped mattering a long time ago. She thought about the room, the chamber, 41 delegates and one empty seat, the human seat, was empty now, but it would not always be. Someone would sit in it, maybe not for years. There were decisions to make, appointments to negotiate, the slow machinery of two civilizations establishing the protocols for operating in proximity, but the seat was there, the chair was clean and kept, and there someone would sit in it. She hoped they would be ready for the smell of the air. Sul of the Peller did not go back to his quarters immediately. He sat in the chamber after the other delegates filed out, after the signed document was taken by the administrative secretary and processed and logged and sent to the archive, where it would sit in perpetuity as the formal record of a day that would be taught in whatever passed for history classes across 23 species for the next several hundred years. He sat in the chamber and listened to the translation hardware hum and the ventilation move old air around, and thought about nothing in particular. After a while he thought about something. He thought about the message he was going to send to the Polari Historical Archive. He had been composing it in his mind for the last few hours in between all the other things his mind was doing, and now he let it become a sentence. They came back, as they always do, 7 words. That was one more than last time. He was getting verbose in his old age. He pulled his terminal toward him and opened the archive filing system and typed the sentence and attached it to the ongoing human observation file, the file he had been adding to for 60 years, the file that had 17 previous entries, the file that the archive had 3 times tried to close and that he had 3 times requested be kept open on the grounds that the subject was not yet resolved. He submitted the entry. The archive system sent back an automated confirmation, file updated, status open. He closed the terminal. The chamber was empty now, just him and the table and the ceiling and the ventilation and the display which someone had cleared. The list was gone. The tactical feed was gone. The display was dark and waiting for the next session, whenever that was. Whatever it would be about. He sat for another moment, then he stood slowly, carefully, the joints doing what the joints did, and when I find something to drink. Vorheth did not go back to his warship immediately either. He went to the observation deck on the station's upper level, a civilian space, not a command space, which was why he chose it. He stood at the forward window and watched the pale resolve move away. It was a long time before it disappeared. He watched until it did. He was calculating. He was always calculating. The KTH mind, trained from young age in military projection and strategic planning, did not stop calculating. The way water did not stop being wet. It was what he was. The calculation he was running now was new, not the kind he was used to running, not fleet positioning, not engagement windows, not force ratios. He was running a different kind of arithmetic. He was calculating what it cost, not the stations. The stations were strategic losses, significant ones, but they could be absorbed, not the buffer corridor. It was a constraint, but workable. Not even the seat at the council table, though that one sat differently than the others. He was calculating the cost of the 40 years, and then the 11, what it cost to build something like that without anyone knowing what kind of species paid that cost, without complaining about it, without announcing it, without. And this was the thing he kept returning to, the thing that had been sitting in the corner of his calculation since Yarrows had said it in the chamber without wanting to. We wanted to be left alone. He had spent his entire life as a being that did not want to be left alone. The KT did not want to be left alone. They wanted to be central. They wanted their position recognized and maintained and reinforced. This was not a personal preference, it was species level. Psychology built over millennia, as fundamental as the shape of his jaw. He could not entirely understand a species for which the central preference was not this, not power, not recognition, not position, just not this, just the clear line in space and the space behind it, and the right to be unremarkable inside it. He did not understand it. He understood what it had produced. That was clear enough. He understood too that he was thinking about it the way he was, because he needed to understand the thing he was facing in order to face it correctly. The Keth did not forget. Everyone knew this. Yaravos knew this. He had watched her face in the chamber, and she was not a person who did not know things. She knew that Keth did not forget. She had built the fleet anyway. He looked at the space where the pale resolve had been. He would think about this for a long time. He would bring the calculations back home and put them in front of the people who needed to see them. There would be responses, adjustments. The KE military doctrine had been written against a known galaxy, and the known galaxy had changed today. And doctrine that did not change with the galaxy it was written for was just a record of past confidence. He was not finished. He wanted Yara Voss to know that. He suspected she already did. He turned from the window and walked back toward the command sections. The news reached Earth 14 hours later, not in a broadcast in the quiet way that news traveled through official channels when official channels were still getting used to what they were carrying: data, packets, signal relays, the bureaucratic infrastructure of information moving from point to point until it arrived at terminals on the planet it was about. By the time it reached the public networks, it was early evening in the Eastern Hemisphere, mid-afternoon in the West. People were finishing work, making food, arguing with their families, sitting in traffic, watching things on screens, doing all the ordinary architecture of a day in a market district in a city, not a famous city, not a city that appeared in history text, just a city. A woman was running a food stall. She had been running it for 6 years. She made a specific kind of grilled flatbread that people came to this particular stall specifically for, and she had a system for it, and the system worked, and she had spent the last 6 years being very good at a thing that mattered to the people who came to her stall. She had not been following the news. She was grilling flatbread when the notification came through on her terminal, the one she kept by the side of the grill for timing purposes and occasionally for checking the weather, and she did not look at the notification immediately because she was flipping the bread at a critical moment, and the bread did not care about notifications. She flipped the bread. Then she glanced at the terminal. She read the first line of the notification. She read it again. She stood for a moment, then she looked up at the sky. Not because she heard anything. There was nothing to hear. The pale resolve was not visible from the ground. Nothing was visible from the ground except the early evening sky, blue at the edges, going dark at the center, the first stars starting. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she smelled the bread and looked back down and took it off the grill before it burned. The man at the Front of the queue cleared his throat. She handed him his bread. He paid. He left. She started the next one. The sky was the same color it had always been. The stars were where they had always been. The market was the same market. The noise the same noise. The smell of grilling and spice in evening, and the particular complicated smell of a city that had been a city long enough to have a smell. The woman grilled the next piece of bread behind her. Her terminal cycled to the next notification, then the next. The news was spreading through the public networks now, the way water spreads on a flat surface outward in all directions, finding every low point, becoming unavoidable. She would read all of it later when the stall closed. She would sit with a meal she had made for herself and read what had happened today. And she would think about it for a long time. She did not know yet how she would feel. She thought she would feel many things in the way you feel many things about a history you have been inside your whole life. For now she grilled the bread above her somewhere past the blue that was going dark, that was full of stars that looked the same as they always had. The pale resolve moved through space at cruise speed, heading home. It had not fired a single weapon. It had not needed to. The stars looked the same as they always had. They were not